So we are in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 24. And it's not without some interesting situations here in this passage, and this is why. Paul says, "Wives, subject yourselves to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body." Verse 24, "But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything." Now, what's very interesting is verse 22, look over my shoulder, "subject yourselves" has no Greek word. That is in italics in the New American Standard Bible, which means it was added by the translators of the NASB to make sense of the passage. Why? Why would they choose "subject yourselves" when there's no verb there? It just says "wives to your own husbands." It doesn't provide any sort of verb in that sentence. So why would they choose "subject yourselves"? Why not love? Wives, love, display love to your husbands, or grace, or whatever the case may be. Well, it's because of the rest of the paragraph that the translators inserted that verb. Because verse 24, the third sentence, the third verse in this paragraph, it says, "But as the church is subject to Christ, so also wives to their husbands in everything." So the translators felt that because being subject is the point that Paul is making there in verse 24, it must be the point he's making in verse 22. And so subject in verse 24, subject to, is hupotasso, which means that you're under obedience. Now, I understand that there are some denominations who take this and utilize this, really weaponize this, to downplay the role that women have in ministry, and in some denominations don't even allow them to have any part in ministry. They could teach the kids, they can watch the babies in nursery, but they can't preach from the pulpit, they can't teach a Bible study if they're teaching a man, because of what Paul says, "I do not allow a woman to preach." He never says Jesus doesn't allow it, he says, "I do not allow it." And so they take that and they superimpose that on that Jesus doesn't allow it. And we'll probably have to cover that issue in another video, because I have some very strong feelings about that. And I feel like that my feelings are in line with what Jesus did with women in ministry. His role, how he elevated their role, elevated their witness, elevated their importance, and not downplayed it. However, I know that people have some strong feelings about this. So what is really, how do we figure this out? What is Paul really saying here? And I think what's important is to understand, and this is how I interpreted it. Yes, if the husband is the head, like Christ is the head of the church, then what is the wife? And in my experience, if the husband is the head, the wife is the heart. And that doesn't mean that the heart is any less important. You have to have the heart in order to function, just like you have to have the head. And so I've seen it in my marriage as well, that, I am trying to solve problems and I'm trying to think through things, and my wife will come alongside me and say, "Hey, this person had a really rough day. I think you should probably send him a message." And I'm trying to think through possible solutions to help fix the problem they're in. And her, from her heart perspective, is like, "Hey, honestly, just a text message or a phone call today would be helpful. And then we can find out what they need and act on that, instead of just like acting and trying to solve a problem." Maybe they don't need me to solve their problem. Maybe what they need is reassurance. Maybe what they need is compassion. Maybe what they need is the heart. And so it doesn't mean that the heart is lesser than. We do subject ourselves. And so essentially when my wife says, "Hey, maybe you should call them," I can say, "You know what? I know what I'm supposed to do, and I'll do what I want to do." I mean, yeah, I could do that. And because, I've got free will, and I don't have to do what anybody says if I don't want to. But at the same time, I recognize that that's good advice. And so the head and the heart are work when they work perfectly together, it is a beautiful thing. And that's what I think is really the picture here between Christ and the church. Is Christ is the head. We are under obedience to Christ, but he needs us to be his hands and his feet, to be the ones that see the hurting people around us, share the gospel with them, do acts of compassion and kindness, so that we can demonstrate the love of Jesus Christ to people. So yes, if Christ is the head, then the church is the heart. And if the husband is the head, then the wife is the heart. And it doesn't mean that one is better than the other, as far as husband and wife. It just means that we have to work together. And when we do, it is a beautiful and unifying thing. So that's my take on Ephesians 5:22 through 24. Let me know what you think. Be respectful when you comment, because certainly I know there are people who disagree with some of the things I've said in this video. So if you disagree, feel free to tell me what you disagree with, and share your verses, your scriptures that you think that justify what you believe. But I just thought that was a really cool picture, that we can look at this verse in a little bit of a different perspective this way. So have a great week.